So I think that what we're sustaining is not the systems or the environment or the situation that we have today. What we're trying to sustain is, if you want to call it that, essentially the quality of life.
Are you interested in upcoming urban trends? What do you think about the need for investigating multiple futures in foresight? How can we utilize different timeframes to prepare for the future? Stay tuned for answers from Petra Hurtado.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Petra Hurtado, Chief Foresight and Knowledge Officer at the American Planning Association. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities, urban trends on different timescales, the future of workplace, technology, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Petra Hurtado, Ph.D., serves as the Chief Foresight and Knowledge Officer at the American Planning Association, where she spearheads APA's foresight practice to foster innovation and resilience in planning. Holding a Ph.D. in urban planning from the Vienna University of Technology, Petra specializes in strategic foresight, futures literacy, urban futures, emerging technologies, urban sustainability, and environmental psychology. Before APA, she worked globally as an advisor, planner, and educator in sustainability. Petra has taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland and Vienna University of Technology, covering foresight, sustainability, and environmental psychology. A sought-after keynote speaker, she has presented at global conferences and guest lectured at institutions like Harvard, GSD, and Virginia Tech. Passionate about empowering communities, Petra blends academic rigor with practical insights to inspire action and drive positive change in dynamic urban environments. And with that, Petra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your opinions on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Great question. So I'm an urban planner and I've worked in the urban sustainability arena for over 2 decades at this point. And that's obviously all about making sure cities can provide livable futures, sustainable futures, environmentally healthy futures, all of that. And in addition to that, in my role at the American Planning Association, where I've been now for 6 years, I have developed approaches for planners on how they can use foresight and futures thinking in their work to make their plans really more resilient, inclusive, agile, and really reflect the future and not what's going on today in their plans for the future of cities and communities. All of that together, having that sustainability work and mindset, as well as having been in foresight and futures thinking, the future of cities is really on my mind 24/7, I could say. So it's a very important topic to me.
Then let's unpack this very important topic. What does the city mean to you?
I'm in general a city person. Maybe that's why I chose this profession. Although I have to say, obviously, as a planner, we're also looking at rural areas and smaller town communities. But when it comes to city, I feel like there's so much just special about them when it comes to the community that can be created there, the innovation, the many things that really come from the community that's there, as well as the diversity, and of course, the architecture, the amenities, the services. The fact that you can have, in some cities at least, a lot of things in a walkable distance from your home is just what I like about cities, which is also usually the factor how I choose the cities I lived in. I've lived in multiple cities in my life, and all of them were very walkable and essentially gave me that expectation.
I wanted to ask something else, but you mentioned that you always choose where to live, partially based on that you can walk everywhere. Is Chicago, where you reside, a walkable city?
It is to some extent. So it depends where you are in Chicago, but especially the neighborhoods close to the lake are very walkable. Chicago, I always say, is a hidden gem. It's a secret that we don't tell a lot of people so that we can have it for ourselves.
Fair enough. I have friends in Australia who say this about Adelaide, that it's a gem, don't tell anyone. Here you are, audience. Now, I wanted to go back to the thing you mentioned regarding cities, that you also think about towns and communities. Is there a differentiating something which in your mind differentiates towns, communities, and cities?
There's certainly a difference between big cities and rural communities, just based on size and the things that are offered there, the variety of systems, services, and also people. Obviously, as a planner, we think a lot in those scales because when it comes to planning things like be it land use or infrastructure systems, you think very differently in a big city versus in a rural community. Also, when it comes to the things that are happening in this community, are there a lot of companies, businesses, jobs, or is it more a residential community, which in the US, there's a lot of separation of these uses versus in Europe where there's more mixed areas. It's been changing in the US as well. But in general, I would just say as planners, we think a lot of in scale and we really go from the building scale to the neighborhood to the city or town.
I'm glad you mentioned that you are thinking across these scales because talking with architects mainly, I'm an architect by profession, we tend to forget that with the building, we are influencing the other scales. So we will get back to that. But first, I understand that this is the city. What does the future of the city look like for you?
So I think there's different emerging developments that can go one way or the other. And a lot of it obviously depends on where in the world you are. But I think there's some global trends and global developments that the question is really what the impact will look like on a local scale. Big drivers that we are seeing at this point are obviously climate change, technological innovations such as artificial intelligence, political shifts here and there, the way society is changing, shifting. And all of these are factors that will impact what cities in the end will look like in this world. I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's also challenges, right? And the question is always how we are in the end dealing with these evolving trends and how we're dealing with their impacts on the communities. I don't think there's like the one size fits all recipe of how I would describe the future of cities. In the end, it will be what we make of it, and especially where the city is located. A lot of it, especially in planning, depends on political will. So as planners, you can create the best plans of what you envision, or usually we do that together with the members of the community, what they envision their city should look like. But then obviously there's a lot of external drivers that can change that. And then you always have the political will that needs to be a part of it as well. Otherwise, the plan might not get implemented.
And that's a bummer always. I loved that you mentioned that the future will differ. And I loved that in your original description for the future of cities, you mentioned futures. Because I believe that there are different futures for different places, different cities, different communities. However, I always get the feedback that why are we talking about futures in plural? That's not something people understand.
That's a great question because that's something that I've been really working on for the last 6 years, learning about, because that's really how we approach futures at a.k.a. as part of our Foresight program, where we just acknowledge we can't predict the future and there's multiple options of what the future could look like. And one part of this program is really trying to bring this concept to the planning profession, because while planners are planning for the future of their communities, they usually don't plan with the future. And that's the concept that we want to bring to them. But we really say, yeah, it's great if we have these visioning exercises and then we have plans on what our cities should look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years. The problem is these plans a lot of times really assume that cities are almost frozen in time, right? And all the changes that are happening are just what we put in our plans, and that's just unrealistic. Really encouraging planners to include multiple plausible futures in their work and then create plans that are able to pivot along the way, depending on what trends or emerging trends really become the drivers of change and additional change factors in what the future in the end will look like.
How can we do that? And I'm curious whether it's only planners who can work with this kind of thinking, because, for example, I read Jane McGonigal's book titled Imaginable, which encourages people, random people, to think about specific scenarios in the future and live through it today, which means that they can prepare for the future if something like that happens in the distant future. So how can we work with these multiple futures?
The book that you just mentioned is right behind me in my bookshelf. The interesting thing is that this concept actually originated in the military and really came out of the Cold War, where there was a lot of thinking about what if, and if this, then that. The one side does the one thing, how will the other side react? So the whole idea of scenario planning and preparing for multiple futures, as you just described, it really comes from that era. And it later really into business world in terms of business strategy. So a lot of business consultants use this to help companies either future-proof their strategy or the strategy around a specific product. How can I make sure that what I'm producing and selling today is still relevant in 10, 20, 30 years? And so I really borrowed this concept from business strategies, really strategic foresight, and translated it into planning. And that's how we're using it at APA now. I have to say we've been adjusting and evolving it over the years because obviously the military is all about war games. Business strategy is all about profit making. Now, planning is for the common good. Now, how can we translate this method into planning so it actually helps us achieve what we're trying to do? So in the case of planning, what we've been looking at a lot is how can we use methods such as scenario planning in a community context. So for example, doing these exercises together with community members and not just as the planner's expert. Because the great thing about this is you don't have to be an expert in anything to do it. There's very simple methodologies. There are different versions of those depending on what the needs are. But all of that can be done in groups of people without any expertise in planning or scenario planning or anything related to that. I also realized over the years it's a great tool for team building. So we're doing a lot of this work in my team at APA as well to get to certain outcomes that we need for our work. But then in parallel, it's been always great fun doing it. And the team really got closer by doing it, which is a wonderful side effect of this. But I always say, and I always talk about planning, but I think that can relate to many other professions and even to personal life. You can really use futures to bring people together in the present. And that's really our main goal with bringing this method and this way of thinking into the planning profession. But I think that can be a great side effect and add on in many other situations in life as well as other professions.
I personally am a huge fan of this evolution because I believe that we need to create urban conscious evolution where we create the future instead of the future happening to us. So I'm all for this thinking. Before we move on, what time frame are you thinking when you are talking about the future?
So with the work that we do at APA, we really think in 3 time frames, and they don't have a specific number of years attached to them. They're really more about the action item and what does it mean. So we have what we call the act now time frame, which are usually existing trends and shifts and things that are already happening around us, where we can already understand what their impacts are and where we say, okay, we need to act on those already. The second time frame is the prepare time frame, which is obviously further out. We can have things in the prepare time frame that are going to happen next year or in 10 years. But the main point here is these are things that are emerging right now and that now is the time to start preparing for them. In the planning world, that would mean this is the time to think about how can we create policies that address this? How can we include thinking about this in our plans in terms of what are potential impacts and how can we prevent the negatives and foster the positives? And then the third time frame is the learn and watch time frame. And a lot of times these are things that are really far out, but sometimes there are things that are suddenly speeding up and suddenly they end up in the act now time frame. But learn and watch time frame is really about things that we call them signals. So not really trends yet, maybe potential future trends, but really things that stick out and where we kind of see that if those things become trends in the future, they will be highly disruptive. The idea here is to really keep watching them, see where they're going, if they actually become trends or if they just were blips. But then also, and that's why it's called watch and learn, to learn more about them, because a lot of times these are things that are completely unrelated to planning, but we also understand if they become trends, they will creep into planning, they will impact the work of planners. So we're not really adding specific years to them, although we talk about, when you talk about a specific trend or a specific signal, like, yeah, this is probably realistic in this or that time frame, but we usually avoid naming or calling out numbers of years, because right now I feel like that's getting more and more difficult anyways, because everything is accelerating. One fun experience related to that was actually, we have this annual trend report that we're publishing, and that report is structured in these 3 time frames. And we started with that 5 years ago. And I think 5 years ago, we were debating, should we put artificial intelligence in the context of planning into watch and learn or into prepare? And so we were like, let's maybe put it into prepare, but parts of it could still live in watch and learn. Today, it's always in the act now timeframe. So also seeing how these trends and topics move across timeframes in a very short amount of time is very fascinating.
Indeed, it's very fascinating. That's why I would love to ask you a few examples for each time frames.
So in act now, over the years, we've had a lot about climate change. That's always a big topic. And we've been trying to focus on different climate change related topics every year to not repeat the last year. But I would say this year and last year, we talked a lot about climate migration, climate displacement, also specifically in the US, the context of home insurance and issues with that, because a lot of insurance companies are moving out of places that just constantly get flooding from hurricanes or wildfires and otherwise. So that's a big trend here. Another topic is heat. Obviously, the world is getting hotter. Every year we have a new record in terms of hottest year on record. So that's usually a big one in the act now timeframe. Obviously, there's a lot of technological innovations really across all 3 timeframes. The biggest one in act now right now is obviously artificial intelligence. There's also a topic where we try to have different focus areas every year, because there's always something new to say about it. So this year we focus, when it comes to AI, on its impacts on the environment, really with the data centers and the energy use and water use for cooling. And obviously all of that can have an impact on planning, on decisions on where should these data centers go, and impacts on the community there. I just read an article today that in Finland, I think they now use the waste heat from data centers to actually do district heating and cooling. A good idea to do that. So those are the type of topics. We also have usually different societal changes and shifts, demographics. This year, we looked specifically at what we call the new average. Interestingly, we have over 100 different definitions of what a household can look like these days. We have over 40 definitions of what a family can look like. Meanwhile, federal definitions in the US, and assuming elsewhere as well, are still pretty stuck with the old definition of 2 parents and 1 or 2 kids. So that's obviously interesting to look at. A fun fact, in the US, we now have more households with pets than with kids, which can also impact questions when it comes to planning for the future of cities. Do we need more playgrounds or dog parks? So those are like some of the act now topics that we've been looking at. I'm trying to think right now in prepare. Actually, really, since COVID-19, we've had a lot of questions about the future of work. And many of those end up in the prepare timeframe, mainly because there's so much uncertainty around them. There's no clear trajectory yet where a lot of these things go, be it about going back to the office or working hybrid or working fully remote. When we talk about the future of the office, I believe it's really going to be a more custom-made, bespoke type of situation, because we see that trend go in many different directions. We see companies that go fully remote. We see companies that come back into the office full-time. And then we have everything in between. There are some that say we need a bigger office space for our hybrid work, because when we're in the office, we do teamwork and workshops and collaboration. We need all these collaboration spaces. Then there's others that say, no, we need smaller office space because we do hybrid and people come in on different days, so we can do office sharing. So it's really a little bit all over the place. And even though these are things that are happening now and have been happening since the pandemic, it's not clear where they're going. And so that's why a lot of these future of work and future of the office topics really live in the prepared time frame. We also had this year, related to the future of work, some thoughts on with the technological developments around AI, but then also developments around 4-day work weeks and other things. What will the future of work in general look like? Will we have a life of leisure in the future where we don't actually have to work as much as we do today? Also, looking back for the last almost 100 years, we've been working 40-hour work weeks. We've had all these inventions from computers to emails to now AI, and we're still working 40 hours a week. Is that going to change? So a lot of these types of topics are in the prepare. We always bring something about global dynamics as well. What are some of the global dynamics, be it from a political perspective or from economic perspective and otherwise, and how those might impact the local level, obviously looking at the planner's lens. And so also here, because it's more global and maybe not directly connected to community planning, but still there's potential for impacts. That's why a lot of these trends also live in the prepare time frame. Moving further to the learn and watch, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I'm always fascinated what we find. But that really ranges from technological developments, where there's really the sky's the limit. There's so much going on, really ranging from quantum computing, fusion energy, 3D printing. Now we talk about 4D printing. There's a lot of interesting stuff. One topic where we almost every year have something in the report is outer space and different programs there, which might seem totally unrelated to planning. But when you take a closer look and look at some of these NASA programs, there's now programs about how we could generate solar energy directly from the sun and bring it back to Earth with microwaves. There's programs on farming in outer space. They had tomatoes grown in the International Space Station that came back, I think, 2 years ago or last year. I still haven't found out if anybody actually ate them. That's still an unanswered question. So NASA has a big farming program where they even hire farmers now to get some insights. They also look into mining on Mars and the moon. There's also talking about building infrastructure on the Mars and even having people live there, which is relatively unrealistic based on the environment there. But at the same time, there's also projects going on about genetically modifying the human body so people could actually be able to live on Mars. So it's fascinating what we find. And while obviously that's far out future, but at the same time, we also know they're already hiring farmers at NASA. Will they be hiring planners to think about how to plan on Mars? I'm very skeptical about that in general, based on the question, do we want to really put all this money into this versus just trying to preserve our planet? It seems like our planet is getting too small. That's why we now need to expand to outer space. But yeah, those are all things that we bring in the report. What's important for us is to always bring it back to planning. What's the impact and why is this important for planners to know about? And I was just very cynical about outer space topic, but what's really important in this work too is that we stay neutral. So in the report, we really just put out the facts and then explain why this is important for planners to know about. We don't judge it as it's a good thing or a bad thing. We're just saying these are things that are important that you all know about, and that's why we're talking about them.
The outer space is fascinating for me as well, because I had a panel conversation in episode 250 and they were talking about the different aspects of creating cities in space. And for example, one could argue that bringing industry, manufacturing, for example, to space would help us create more environmentally friendly life on Earth. So that's another perspective for that. And I wanted to go back to two things. One is that it's amazing that work and how its future will change is still in the preparedness and not in the act now, because that's just bonkers for me. I have been working remote, which changed from the usual working habits. But that's a very interesting insight that it's still in the prepared time frame.
Maybe if I can explain a little bit of the reasoning behind that, it's also obviously we're looking at the impacts for planners. So while a lot of companies need to make these decisions now, which also applies to the actual planning office on how they handle their staffing and office environment. But when it comes to the impacts on communities themselves, there's a lot of uncertainty. So for example, in Chicago, we have a lot of empty office space downtown still. It's been a few years, right, since the pandemic has ended. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with this office space. In some cases, architects are experimenting with can that be converted to residential, which in some cases is already happening, but in some cases it's just not that easy. Similar question for transportation planners. How is the whole commute patterns? How is that going to look like? Rush hours, when I look at Chicago, is pretty much back on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. But you can see that a lot of people work remotely Mondays and Fridays. So all of this has really changed, and it's still not clear what direction it will go. And one can really say most of transportation planning, at least, really revolved around a 9-to-5 work schedule. And that might not be a reality anymore in the future.
For me, that's really good. I'm not sure how everybody else feels about this. I wanted to go back to something which you mentioned at the prepared timeframe, that it helps policymakers and decision makers to establish the policies now. And I wanted to ask your opinion because of your expertise and experience. I talked with Finn Morehouse in episode 324 about the unintended consequences of policymaking. He brought in a really good example, I think from New York, where policymakers wanted to encourage the developers to create affordable housing. So they created the policies that if you create affordable housing, you can build higher. That created either the developers' intentions of, okay, I build higher, but I create segregation in the buildings. So there were different staircases for the affordable housing and the non-affordable housing parts. Or the developers said that I don't want to create affordable housing. So they built shorter houses, which meant that the demand for housing was also increasing. Thus, affordability was also shot in the foot. So I'm curious how we can create scenario planning with policymaking and discover these unintended consequences.
Yeah, so that's the $1,000,000 question. When it comes to affordable housing, I'm a little biased because I'm originally from Vienna, and Vienna has a really good affordable housing program where it's just happening across the city and not just in specific neighborhoods and perks in terms of building higher or lower. It's just integrated in the whole city, and you wouldn't even know if your neighbor has lower than market price apartment or not. So that's that. But there are more and more communities and governments that actually apply scenario planning for their policy making. So I think it was last year, I was at a scenario planning conference hosted by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who are our partners in our trend report effort, where we had someone from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, talk about how they used scenario planning to really make the right policy decisions. So I see more and more of these examples pop up, and we are obviously trying to collect some of these case studies to really bring that into policymaking. I think with the accelerated pace of change that we're experiencing, I think it will be more and more important to really become more dynamic on how we create policies so that we can act faster if something changes.
Sorry, I'm laughing a bit because creating policies faster, that's for sure a huge change. And personally, I think that we should do that. But again, please continue.
It's also very interesting because, for example, for years now, we've heard that autonomous vehicles will be hitting the road in 2 years. Well, they're still not here. And there's still a lot of things that don't work the way they should work. There's still a lot of questions about what's the right way, what the policies around that should look like. Meanwhile, a lot of states in the US, for example, have already created policies around that. And my guess is that there will have to be a lot of updating based on where the technology really goes. So it's very interesting how some things are really expected to happen faster and then they don't. And then we have policies that might not work anymore. On the other hand, there's other things that just pop up and suddenly everyone is overwhelmed. My favorite example in this context is always the invention of the smartphone and specifically the iPhone. Because in 2005, when planners create plans for their communities, no one saw that coming. And then just a couple of years later, this invention enabled all these applications that allow for rideshare, for Airbnb, for shopping on the go, for data sharing, all of that stuff. And no one saw it coming and everyone was disrupted by it. That's always my story when I try to convince planners that we need to use foresight in our work, because everyone suffered through that. And suddenly we needed drop off and pick up places instead of parking because everyone's just going around in their Uber or Lyft. That's just a good example to showcase how we need to be more dynamic and how policies are developed to begin with.
And that also really well showcases how I think about democracy, which is tied to Karl Popper's understanding of democracy. Karl Popper talks about how democracy should be not about who should rule, but how we can remove the bad rules and the bad rulers. So we do need this kind of iterative and updating approach to our rules and regulations. I would like to go back. One of the first terms you used, sustainability. What does sustainability mean to you?
I can become very scientific about this. Obviously, the term originates from forestry, right? Where it was about cutting as many trees as you can plant so they would grow back. And that concept essentially is used in many contexts now, where we talk about, for example, the Brundtland report that gives the definition that a lot of professions, including planners, are using in terms of doing our work, living our lives in a way that future generations can have the same quality of life. That's what sustainability really is, which is it has this future focus. It looks at future generations. And that's why it fits in with what I'm doing now at APA with Foresight and Futures Thinking. Because when you work in sustainability, you always have to think ahead and can't just think of the current moment or only your own lifespan. There's always more to that.
I will poke a bit around this because I am at the phase where I question whether sustainability really helps us prepare for the future. Because if we go back to the root of the term, to sustain, that means we are at the same level now and in the future. And that is not the evolution we talked about. That is not the preparedness that we talked about. I want to believe that if we create better futures, that we are not sustaining our systems, our environment, our people just on the same level, but we are progressing, we are developing, we are creating better futures for them, for us, for everything else. I'm curious, how do you think about sustainability and foresight and the future? Because I think that there is an opposing connection between the two.
That's a really interesting question. So I think that what we're sustaining is not the systems or the environment or the situation that we have today. What we're trying to sustain is, if you want to call it that, essentially the quality of life. Acknowledging that a lot of people don't have good quality of life right now. So obviously there has to be an evolution, there has to be improvement. The question is always, what's the starting point, right? And one thing that I've been very interested lately is really even longer term concepts such as the 7 generations principles from Native Americans and how they essentially live in balance with nature, in harmony with nature, and how it's not humans and nature or humans versus nature, we're all part of it, and how that can spur its own evolution, and then really thinking 7 generations ahead. A concept that has been lived, but has been really interrupted and disrupted by, for example, Western culture, if you want to call it that, capitalism, and everything that comes with that. And when you look at a lot of the systems that we've created, political systems, they work in terms, like it can be 4 years, 6 years, whatever the system is. But the goal there is really to get either re-elected or have something like that going on. So there's not a very long-term way of thinking. Similar when you look at capitalism and the way business is done, the ideal is to make profit. In some cases, ideally, you try to make that sustainable in the economic sense, but rarely people really think beyond their own lifespan. I agree with you that maybe the way the definition of sustainability is framed in general can be misleading. I think the question is always, what is it that needs to be sustained and what higher goal is related to that?
Thank you very much for expanding on this. Personally, I am a fan of anti-fragility, where sustainability for me means sustaining the fragile systems, while anti-fragility means that we are creating systems which thrive on shocks, learn from the shocks, become better for the shocks. So that's why it's very interesting for me, because I think that anti-fragility can be a much more suitable way of thinking about the future and foresight. And just coming back to the seventh generation, I just had a conversation during the conference with someone who has talked with many indigenous people, I think in the States. And he mentioned that, interestingly, sometimes 7 generations is not about 7th generation into the future, but the 7 generations you can be connected to during your lifetime. So 3 generations before, one is your generation, and 3 generations after, because you, in theory, could know your great-grandparents and your great-grandchildren. So that's an additional, very interesting understanding of the 7th generation, because then you would think of your lifetime, but still in the future. So it could be also a good addition.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, one trend that we have in the current trend report too is about the fact that we currently have 6 generations in the workplace. This is the first time that this is happening, that we actually have people from the silent generation and baby boomers that are still working, many of them in leadership positions, some of them presidents. But we also have Gen Alpha coming into their internships this year. So we never had in one workplace people from 6 different generations, and that has never happened before, which I think can create a lot of opportunities, but I think for a lot of people, it creates a lot of challenges. It is an interesting way to think that way too, because if you are in the workplace and let's say you are a millennial, somewhere in the middle, right? You have to think backward and forward and integrating all of these generations in your thinking and doing, which can be challenging.
Which brings us neatly to the first 3 questions. What are the 3 biggest challenges regarding the future of cities?
I would say there's really a challenge where there isn't an opportunity too. Like I'm in general an optimist. I always forget who said that quote about never miss to make an opportunity out of a crisis. I don't remember the exact quote right now. But so I guess obviously climate change is a big fear right now in terms of how that's going to play out. And a lot of it is really in our own hands and how we deal with it and how cities will deal with it. And while cities are a cause in a lot of it, they can also be a solution in a lot of it. And bringing that balance together, I think, is a great opportunity, but it has to be seen as that and tackled as that. The second challenge or fear, I would say, is, again, something that can be an opportunity or a challenge, technological innovations and how we implement them. So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about artificial intelligence right now, but also others. But this one is definitely a big one, and it has a lot of opportunity, or it brings a lot of opportunities with it. I think the challenge or fear there is really that it's not being used in responsible ways, and then it can create a lot of negative impacts, be it exacerbating inequalities that are already prevailing. And if we don't know what data goes in and what comes out, and we just blindly use the output of the tool, that won't get us to a happy ending. But again, if we put the right regulations in place, if we train people on how to use these things, create awareness, educate, all of that, then I think it can be a great opportunity on the other side, right? The third one that I've been looking at a lot as part of our work is really how society is changing. And from a planner's perspective, when it comes to cities, how community as a concept is changing. There's an interesting shift towards individualism. A lot of it supported by social media and the me society, as I call it. So really this need to get all the attention, the selfie idea, the posting selfies, looking for how many likes did I get. There's a lot of like me-centered evolution on how the society is. And where I see the fear there is really that if this continues, what's going to happen to the actual community and community thinking? And obviously that has impacts on social systems and otherwise. But when I look at cities specifically, the city has always been the place of community, rigid Florida, the creative class, all of that. but then really this people coming together in one place, innovating, socializing, all of that. Where is that spirit of a city really going with a society that gets more and more individualized and self-centered and all of that?
From my perspective, I understand what you mean, that this kind of individualism is emerging. However, at the same time, I also think that technologies can help us, let's put it that way, create better communities via the internet. So for example, my partner found his community in changing what he want to change in the world, but they are scattered across the globe, in Europe, in the States, in Australia, in Latin America, all over the place. But it's a much more closely tied community than what we could find in our immediate environment. So do you really think that this kind of shift towards individualism in maybe the physical environment to finding your better community online is a trend, or am I misunderstanding something?
What I meant is that a lot of the digital environment kind of fostered this individualism. Just when you look at social media and how it functions, essentially, it's about posting your selfie, getting the likes or getting comments, like how popular am I? And just the concept of a selfie itself. I actually just recently read an interesting book about the selfie and how it impacted tourism. Just really fascinating. That alone says a lot about where human beings are going, right? But I agree with what you said about digital communities. And I actually talked a lot about that during COVID, because there was a lot of concern about what's happening with the idea of socializing and things like that. And I talked about the metaverse and all these things. But in the end, it is a fact that we have an epidemic of loneliness right now. When you look at how we approach public space since the pandemic, it has changed a lot. For example, one thing that we also have in the current trend report is a lot of people just don't use headphones in public anymore. They just watch YouTube videos or listen to their music without headphones, essentially blocking out anything that's around them and essentially annoying everyone else. It is very interesting how this has been developing over the last years. And for example, for me personally, I've lived in many places in the world. I have friends all over the world. And when Facebook came out, that was the best thing that could happen to me at that time, because it's a good way to stay in touch with all these people. You don't have to actively constantly call or send messages or whatever, because you see automatically what they're doing when they're posting it. It's just at this point, social media has evolved to something very different from what it was in the beginning. And again, we have to think of multiple plausible futures. I don't know what the future will look like, but that's something that I've just observed from my personal perspective, but also from the work as a planner, thinking about what does public space look like in a world where everyone is pretty much focused on their own issues, on their own priorities, and what does community look like in a world like that? What does a democratic process look like in a world like that?
Oh, that's a good question. Have you heard of how Maslow's pyramid might need some update? Because we thought that self-actualization is on the top, but Maslow might haven't finished his pyramid because community should be on top, not individuals. And it's in the research Maslow's did. You have been talking about technology, technological innovation, AI, cell phones. What does technology mean to you?
I love that question. I honestly don't have a specific definition. I think anything that's human-made that has some function or purpose, a lot of technology is made without purpose. Specifically in the work that we do, we think of 5 categories, of which technology is one, and the other ones are societal shifts, political shifts, environmental shifts. So that's how we think about anything that's related to inventions that can impact city infrastructure, can impact building materials, can impact tools that planners use themselves. So there's really no limit to what that is. It's just obviously a man-made thing, I would say.
It's very interesting because for me, technology means applied knowledge. And I learned this from RethinkX. It's an international think tank. And I asked this because you were talking about public spaces, and I think public space and green space is a technology we use in cities, which is not usually the understanding. Petra, you have been very generous with your time and answers. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I can share my wishful thinking with you, but in reality, obviously, right now in my current position, my current role at the American Planning Association, I see my role really in spreading the word about futures thinking and foresight methods among the planning profession to really create this awareness that we can't just create a plan based on data from the past and insights from the present, which unfortunately is the reality. We really need to include the future and futures thinking in our plans to, on the one hand, make sure our plans are resilient and not obsolete after 1 year, but also more dynamic, allowing for constant updating because the world turns and is changing with every turn, or right now, maybe even in every second it turns. It's accelerating, and the way planning has been done in a very linear way is just not what we need in the 21st century. So that's really how I hope to be able to contribute to the future of cities.
And please keep up this good work because we need this kind of thinking, that's for sure. I just love how you talk about futures in plural and the scenario planning because, yeah, there are different options and we are changing and it's accelerating. So let's prepare in a dynamic way. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I would encourage everyone to check out our trend report, our Foresight program. You can find more about it on planning.org/foresight. People can also find my email address on that page. So I'm always happy to connect to people. We are actually engaging a whole Trend Scout community in this work. So also the trend report is not just the research department at a.k.a. It's really a global group of people from different professions, from different places in the world. What's also very important to us, different age groups. We have a lot of young folks because we say if we talk about the future, we need to have the future at the table. So also encouraging listeners, if they feel like they can contribute to this work, feel free to reach out and join our community.
Thank you so much, Petra.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to hear from Petra about her experience in thinking about the future and how it brings people together in the present. Not to mention her description of the upcoming generations. Alison Watson in episode 338 and Aaron Staple and Logan Tripkin in episode 340 discussed different aspects of bringing up the next generation. You can find out more about Petra online, all the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Petra's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website, where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?